everyone. Um, so we have a bunch of backlog to get through. So let's get started. 38467. Reader and writer methods for half on Cbor.
Approve.
Yeah. The only question I would have is half with this casing what we're using everywhere. I assume it is because we use single and double as because of the type name. So.
Yep, that'd be my assumption.
Yep.
All right.
Perfect.
Oh, right. I'm supposed to do something silly like. Boom. 1 minute.
New record.
All right. A bunch of stuff on logging that we could possibly reason about, or we can wait and see if Miriam joins the call. I vote wait. And I'm driving. All right. 38984 had platform ID unknown. Eric E, I see you're on the call. Do you know about this one?
No, not off the top of my head.
We're having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Yeah, I heard your voice, but not your words.
Sorry, I said no, not off the top of my head.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's just something for WASM. What do we say for the platform ID?
Right. So this is the legacy API because it's the enum, right?
Right, and the proposal summary here is basically saying, in order to avoid duplicating information, provide an explicit unknown value that we can return from the legacy API.
Okay, so anything that we haven't already started returning an answer will just get unknown.
Yeah. I would probably call that other rather than unknown.
Maybe we should call it go look at system runtime and interop services runtime information.
Yeah.
This enum is deprecated.
Yeah, and just to confirm, like, we never plan on adding anything else to this after unknown or other, correct?
Right. Well, because it's very, yeah, it's weird, and it ended up being effectively limiting because the current values are Mac, Nokia S60, Unix, Win32NT, Win32S, Win32 Windows, which is different than Win32NT, Wince, and Xbox. So it's a weird grab bag already. What got the 0 value?
Win32S.
Yeah.
I mean, should we be marking this thing as obsolete as well? Platform ID?
Probably, but all the obsolescence stuff's being sort of tracked differently.
Yeah, I think this would be good for Immo's new targeted obsolescence proposal, where we'd be able to basically say, if you're using platform ID, you're probably doing it wrong. You want this other thing instead.
Yeah, and really, it wouldn't be on the enum. It would be on the method that returns this. Because I don't think we use it as input anywhere. Yeah, I think
stop other people from using it in their APIs though too, right?
Yeah, I mean we could obsolete both. So yeah, unknown or other both seem reasonable. If they had started with unknown as the 0 value, that would certainly be better, but 0's already taken.
Yeah, and if we keep the value at 7 as proposed here, really all that means to me is that we really shouldn't add anything after it. If we did plan on adding stuff after it in the future, then I would prefer that this has a value of like -1 or something.
I mean, it's not an ordered enum, so the number doesn't matter.
Yeah, it just makes it easier for people to check, especially since if I have a net standard library, for instance, I won't actually be able to compile against the literal unknown value. I'd have to say equals 7 or less than 0 or something.
Yeah,
But, you know, equals 7 isn't bad.
Yeah,
Like,
unknown
this
is
how you do it.
Yeah, we it looks like we have a lot more unknowns in enums than others. So I think good as is, unless there's strong suggestions to use a different name.
Seems fine to me.
Ship it. Or report content, because we don't want people using this, so yes.
Did we say we want unknown instead of something like other?
Yeah, no one strongly objected when I asked for strong objections.
Okay.
There are a few others in existing names, but unknown is far more prevalent.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking from this scenario, it's not that it's unknown. In fact, we do know it. It's just you can't get it from this API.
Yeah, that was why I had suggested other, but it was just a weak suggestion. I didn't really care all that much.
Yeah, and I don't have a strong objection. It's just, given that it is more, given that we do actually know it, other might be a better name.
All right.
It looks like we use this in the operating system version string. Would we expect that to say, when it's other, we would expect it to say other in the string to match the enum value?
I mean, is that off of? But that's off of OS version. Because if we're reporting things like Win32NT, then, like, I guess, does Linux say Linux or does Linux say Unix? And
Right. We always, it always says Unix, right? Even when you're on Mac, because Mono said Unix, and then we match their behavior. So Mac's never, basically anything Unix flavored says Unix.
yeah, I think the OS version is probably not what we want. Like, yeah.
We could also, since we were talking about obsolescence, we could also obsolete the operating system.version string property. It wouldn't be outlandish for it to return other here, because that is basically the stringified version of the enum value.
Yeah. All right. Any objections to the current thing, modulo whatever the string is going to do?
Seems good.
Boom. Hi, Miriam. Spot my
Hello.
hair.
Yeah, so this one, it's basically, I think there's a bunch of overloads that were missing, and the person who created the issue requesting the APIs is basically asking for, so logger messages. Those are the existing the overloads take T1 to T. I'm trying to see from my screen. I think T4, T3. I don't have enough resolution. But then they used to be public first of all, and then not. And then the question is. So we have two APIs. One is define scope, the other one is define. One of them has 8 overloads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 or 8 overloads. The other one only has 4. The ask is to have the same amount for both of them. And then and I believe they used to be public and now they're internal. I'll double check. So I was wondering if this is kind of like a slam dunk API approval or no, it still needs thought.
Well, if they were public and stopped being public, assuming that was not done across versions, then there would be the question of, do you want to bring them public again? But as for just expanding the generic matrix up to 8 on both, that seems easy yes to me, given the first question.
Generally making APIs consistent with each other is, as you had hinted, a slam dunk, generally.
If this always was in our libraries, I would have been able to check how the past ones were in APIs of .NET, right? But I can't otherwise, right? I want to confirm the fact that they used to be public. Is there any way other than APIs of .NET that I can check?
Well, like if I look in APIs of .NET, I see defined scope T1, T2, T3, and T1, T2, and T1, and not the top one. So I don't see the one that returns just func of logger and disposable, but I see the other ones.
Okay.
It's actually below the defined scope.
Thank you, Eric. I can read.
Right.
Down one from where I'm looking.
I don't know why the ordering is different there.
I don't know, but I would believe if you look at an ASCII chart, the less than might come sooner than the parenthesis.
Yes.
So this is literally just asking for defined scope to have up to 6, just like define does?
Yes.
And then adding 7 and 8 on both of them.
Yes. And then I asked why 8, and I don't think they had enough.
I think their answer was because that's what tuple does. But tuple technically does 8 in that it goes 7 and then says etc.
Mm.
And then
Seems fine as requested.
func goes to 16.
Yeah, so func only used to go to 8, I think, but there was a change in, .NET 4.5, I think, to make it go up to 16.
Looks like 4.0
4.0
for action.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I think, so given that these are already public, and it doesn't seem like they went private, or if they did, that was going to be a breaking change. So given that these are already public, certainly adding the T4 through T6 is easy, and if you want to expand it up to T7 and T8, that seems fine.
Okay.
Unless anyone can think of reasons why this is not good.
We go to 8 because that was the old way we used to do it for other things.
Because it's where tuple says it's bored and had enough. For tuple, partially this would have been object size, but it's a class. For value tuple, it would be struct size. But yeah, I don't really know why they went 7 and then complicated other on tuple. But yeah, 8's the historic. Why do you think you need more than this number?
But then on action and func, we said, oh, we need 16.
Yep.
Okay. I mean, I'm fine with not going over 8. I wonder if we need 7 and 8.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if they're just asking, if no one really has a need for them yet, and certainly we can do the same thing that we do for tuple, which is when you hit the end, you make a thing to hold everything else. Yeah, bring it up to parity is easy. If you don't think there's a need for 7 and 8, then maybe we hold those back.
Okay.
But
it's just weird. It's weird for me to go to 8 when if we're gonna go more, why not? I don't know. Why not go the full? Why stop at 8 is kind of the question. Like I think the bringing it up to parity is kind of a slam dunk. Like why does one go to 3 and one go to 6? But then the question is why go to 8 if you're gonna go more? Why not go the whole thing?
Just out of curiosity, I'm looking at the implementation details right now. I don't see anything that would be prohibitive as an implementation detail from going beyond 8. It's just, it seems like it is touching a bit of stuff though. That's all.
yeah, like I imagine for func it's easy. We just define more and more of them. For this, I imagine there's a lot of annoying copy pasta going on. Because generics don't always compose nicely. Alright, I think this covers what we talked about.
And he does say, in the beginning, he said, I'd like to have a logger message.define method that accepts more than 5 type args.
That would be 6. 6
Right.
is more than 5, which
Yeah.
is the parity number.
In general, like I wasn't honestly that keen on seeing that we have a func that goes up to 16 like that. That honestly seems like we're missing a fundamental language or runtime feature, rather than something that we would rather do than make 16 different versions of a given type, along with all of the plumbing required to run them. But in the face of that feature not existing, is this the best we can do? Maybe, but it seems like cruft.
Right. Well, I mean, we're really hitting the limit of where functions are realistically defined, right? Like, things that are longer than this typically have outs and can't use func anyway.
I think it's worth noting that, there's 2 parts. One, most other languages handle this with variadic templates, for example. So you can actually have arbitrary number of parameters to the template or generic. But outside of that, once you start getting above like 4 arguments, you start getting into calling convention weirdness, where you're actually like basically killing perf. And maybe rather than exposing something that's more than let's say 3 arguments, which is generally where we do the cutoff to switch to params anyways, we could define the one that takes, for example, T4. We could recommend people that take something more than, let's say, T4 as they should pass in a value tuple here, which is infinitely extensible, will be passed more efficiently, and solves the issue of I've got a lot more parameters I need to pass.
Yeah, I mean that would be, and that'll be true for all things returning long funcs or long number of argument funcs. Yes, not that there's
Although
a type func.
I'd assume the reason that they did 16 here is because func itself goes up to 16.
Well, they only went to 8.
Nope. Our current implementation of func goes up to 16 now. I don't know
Yeah,
why.
no, I mean in this proposal they only went to 8. But 4, 5, and 6 are make define scope look like define, and that makes total sense to me. Of we've already done the one, let's do the other. And there may be reasons that you don't want to do it, but symmetry is better than purity. Right now, in my head.
So would symmetry with func in action mean let's go up to 16 if we're going to go more?
Well, self-symmetry. So the local symmetry. Like, so that's why I think this is an easy yes. And then the comments of, if more are needed, then go for it, and on both define and define scope. And if not, then maybe stop at 6. But if there's a good scenario for 8, then...
So we wrote a check up to 8, but if there was a good scenario for 9.
I would say that this is a check up to 16. Or they can't actually go to 16, they can only go to 14. Because they have one at the start and one at the stop.
Right.
So.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't think we actually would have logger support above like 4, would we? Because that would just switch over to params, wouldn't it?
Apparently no one knows.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, but until someone's actually asking for that, though, it's probably not something. It's a concern for future us, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, based on the comment of, picked 8 as that's where tuple and value tuple stop. As we've already said, I would stop at 6 and 6. If you need more, then I don't think you need to come back to this meeting. Unless Steve wants to jump in with a really quick why we don't want to add more generic overloads.
Sorry, I only just joined. I have no context.
Yeah, that's fine. You could have just seen a lot of T's on the screen and went, no!
No! How's that?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Approved.
But why aren't we defining a custom delegate type that takes them all as ins?
Because guidelines say don't use in.
Okay.
That was easy. All right. Wait, there was another blocking one. I don't know how I lost it. And I feel that there was a different one. Apparently not. Did I approve the right thing? Yep. Weird, because there was something about a attribute. I thought, oh, no. Okay, alright. Losing my mind. Blocking was 3 days ago, but Corey just marked it ready for review.
Yeah.
Way to jump to the top, Corey.
Yeah, I can do this one. basically, we have a couple needs for people to be able to define encoding in HTTP headers. The HTTP spec actually doesn't formally support encodings. It's kind of a contract between the client and server. They just have to know that if they send non-ASCII characters, that they will be interpreted correctly. So this is a little bit of a dangerous feature in terms of like people misusing it. But essentially for reverse proxies, we need to be able to pass headers in unaltered between ASP and HTTP client, and we've got a few other requests just for talking to very specific servers. So we added these properties on sockets handler and multi-part content that allows people to essentially plug in a callback that says, for this header name and this request message, use this encoding.
So the guidance we have for when to not use func is when you think that there's not enough information in the types to tell people what is going on. I know that looking at this, I don't. Yeah, it's like I don't know that I would know what string is or what the string is, but possibly the only way that I would like. I can be convinced either way that func is right or that a custom delegate is needed, just so that you can name the string parameter and let someone know what they're going to get back.
We could certainly have a delegate. I'm a little less worried about this. We kind of don't want people to use this API. Like, this is super advanced scenario, so it not being super easy to consume just by reading the API service maybe isn't terrible.
I can buy that.
I'm fine with the func. I do have a question on the request message and response message. So first, I'm not. It feels like we're trying to predict future scenarios that require their inclusion. I'm not sure that they actually are warranted, but I know, Corey, you said you had some scenarios where you thought maybe potentially theoretically they could be used. But the response one in particular, we're going to be handing out a response message that is not baked yet. That seems dangerous.
Yeah, we could change that to the request message. It might actually be better in that case because I think there are a few places in our implementation where we like expect 100, for instance, we can end up rereading headers over multiple responses for a single request. So that maybe we change the response message to a request message.
But even with the request message, like there are, depending on the order of the headers, they could end up seeing differences in the request message, right? Like if we get a location header, we will update the request message URI with that location. So depending on the order, the request message will change per invocation of the delegate.
Yep.
That also seems weird. I mean, obviously they could close over something that might give them access to the request message that was being used, but we're explicitly handing it to them. I don't know. It feels.
Yeah. So the scenario here is, please write these bytes as I give them to you, right?
More or less, yeah.
But that the API takes a string because that's what sensible entities.
So the API is taking the string header. The encoding is used for the value.
Sorry, I mean the existing like add header and stuff. Those
use strings.
Yeah, those are all strings.
Right. Because I'm just wondering if there's like if varying encodings is needed, or if the only real use is I would like to give you the bytes directly for this header value.
Well, but in some cases, that's for the request direction, but in the response direction, the server is sending bytes and they're handed out to the user as a string.
But does Kestrel need that direction as well?
This has nothing to do with Kestrel.
Well, the reverse proxy will need to read the bytes from a response and forward them to the client making the request. So,
right.
Yeah.
This is some server sent something. It may or may not be Kestrel, and the value of the header needs to be translated from bytes to a string.
Right. Okay. So this is, you're reading a response and you want to give it an encoding value that essentially just passes everything, and you're going to give it to that same encoding value, which is going to just put it back. So you tell it this is UTF-16 LE, and it just parties on without validating that it's sane or whatever.
Right.
Yep.
Otherwise, you would end up with potential YARP means that you get a replacement character inserted into the response, whereas something else would have passed the bytes direct. Because it seems like I understand that encoding is the right thing for, we had a string, we're turning it into bytes, now we have some bytes and we're turning it into a string. It just feels like it's a very powerful and flexible thing that has a very scoped need. And Steve's concerns of every time that you see the request, it may be subtly changed based on how other headers got interpreted.
Yeah.
To be clear, I don't have any problem with the delegates. I was just questioning the second argument to them.
Yeah, it's really the main use that I can see for having the request message is if you want to change how you're interpreting headers based on like what domain you're accessing. For instance, if you have a client, it's common for a client to be used as a singleton to access multiple domains. Maybe you just want to special case one of them. At the same time, I could easily see the recommendation being, you have this special domain, just give it its own HTTP client. So
wouldn't work across
we could live
redirects
without having the request message. At the same time, once we define this delegate, we can, but it's not ideal to add a second delegate down the line if we find out that something in the request message might have been useful. The message also has like that property bag on it that we talked about it earlier in the week. So it's kind of also an extensible way for users to pass in state if they need that.
By the way, I have seen, you had asked if there are scenarios where you want to inspect the host before making a determination as to the encoding. I have actually seen that in practice. I've seen applications that, when they communicate across the internet, use Punycode when they encode the host header. But if they're communicating across the intranet, they use UTF-8. I don't know why, but it's what I saw in practice.
Of course, then there's that whole, what does this host mean? What domain is it in? Or sorry, what scope is it in? Problem, but that's their problem.
That's interesting. I guess you could come up with an encoding that went to Punycode and then encoded that into bytes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we don't have one of those, but I guess you could write one.
Yeah, I mean, you would just call the whatever thing that has a name that's obvious once you know what it is.
It's IDN map. No, not IDN mapping. It's
IDN mapping.
Yeah.
IDN mapping dot whatever the method on that is, and then run that through the classic
get ASCII, and then run that through encoding dot ASCII or get whatever.
Yeah.
Like I said, I didn't say this was a good idea. Just I saw it in practice.
Yeah.
Well, this whole thing exists for not good ideas, but seen in practice, right?
Indeed. Okay, so all right. So was that both request header and response header selectors take the request message as their
feel like if we're going to do that, my biggest concern was handing out the partially filled response message. So if we change it to request message, we feel like that's useful for the host or for the URL or whatever, and accept the fact that it may have changed between since the last invocation. I guess that's reasonable.
Okay, and it looked like in the chat, Levi proposed a delegate header encoding selector of to context instead of using func.
Yeah, where to context is the request message or the HTTP content. Like I don't know if it's a good idea, but it allows you to have a single name delegate.
You mean you're suggesting that delegate would then be used for Kestrel as well, for like they would change their signature?
If they wish. By the way, I had a quick question, a related question. In the header encoding selector scenario, is the HTTP content itself also unbaked? Like, is there any risk to accessing that properties?
The HTTP request content should be baked as it was supplied by the caller before it was passed into the send. We also should not have started actually forwarding it yet if we're sending headers, I guess with the exception of if something like a redirect caused us to do it again, we would have already tried to send the content once.
Yeah, the multi-part content property is interesting because the HTTP content there basically is just a this. So that could be it's basically a way to overload a method when you can't overload one. I'm not super sure what you could do with that HTTP content when you have it.
But presumably that selector is only selected for the outbound, for the request, not for the response, correct? Because you can't generate a multi-part content until you've already decoded the headers. So you have like kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? Like you can't set a property on an object you don't yet have.
Well, no, the multi-part content can contain that can contain multiple requests or responses. So that selector would be used for the inner requests or responses, not the main request headers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, so for the custom delegate or not, I guess I'll leave it as a note that it was suggested, and it's whether it seems valuable to be able to name the parameter. But if you believe that this is sort of we have a scenario that needs it, but we kind of hope no one other than YARP or a theoretical YARP competitor would use it, then that's...
Levi, I misheard what you said. I thought you said HTTP request message or HTTP context, not content. That's why I was asking about Kestrel.
Oh, no, sorry. I guess the other question here is this now forcing you to materialize header names or strings?
We're already doing that.
As an implementation detail or as a public contract?
As the contract.
Well,
I mean, in theory, we could hold the
for
original byte buffer and kind of late initialize the header dictionaries if we wanted to, but in practice, I don't know when we would do that.
For request, so for request messages, like they're already strings. That's just the way it is, unless we were to add a new API that allows you to pass them as bytes, in which case we would have to materialize them to pass it as string. Similarly, for a response, we can, we only have to, technically we only have to materialize them as Corey was saying, if someone actually either accesses the header or it's one we need internally to do our job. And if we were to add an additional API that allowed access to the raw headers, we could do that in a way that didn't require that. But then again, if we did that, it wouldn't require an encoding either.
The only other note I had is this kind of is a dangerous API to use, because if you think this is just a quick way to add Unicode support to HTTP client, you're going to have a bad time when the server tries to interpret your UTF-8 as Windows 1252 or something like that. Maybe worth adding a dangerous prefix to these.
I gave the same feedback yesterday. I personally don't think we should. There are plenty of other ways to use the APIs on HTTP client to do dangerous things.
I mean, assuming it's not currently validating that you don't insert a bunch of null characters in your string, like it's already possible to probably send malformed or confusing data. And
yeah, I mean, in that case though, it's kind of, you have to, maybe not intentionally, but it seems much rarer to do that than to just say, oh, this is how I add Japanese support to HTTP client. That seems like a much more innocent error that anyone could make.
Right, but if the problem is they're asserting and encoding, and then they call a server and the server comes back with malformed request, like that's you get smacked very quickly.
Yeah, we're just depending on the server to validate in that case, which they should be.
So, yeah, I don't think it's. Well, it may mean that you're speaking gibberish to the other side. You can do the same thing with TCP client, so I don't.
Yeah, or socket or whatever.
Yeah, I don't. It doesn't hit my personal. Maybe we need scare words here bar.
Yeah, I agree with Jeremy's assessment. If there's a mistake here, you're going to discover it very quickly. It's not going to surprise you in production, and that's the kind of thing that we tend to be scared by.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.
It's good to bring up, though. I'm glad you did bring it up. Thank you.
Anything wrong in my notes?
Looks good.
I may have done this in the wrong order. We'll see if Emo's tool picks it up. All right, I guess this one's me. So, cryptographic digests. We're out of blocking things, by the way. The current priority or the current filter is things marked as 5, ready for review, oldest to newest. So cryptographic digests in .NET are polymorphic for some fairly reasonable reasons. But frequently you just have some data and you want to hash it in a one-shot, but you have to create a disposable object, ideally in a using, frequently not, and then use it. And people have been asking for a long time of why isn't there a static somewhere that will just do what I want. And so this is that. So while the only thing that I wrote in here is SHA-256, that was just to avoid a bunch of copy pasta across all of the simple digest types, which are MD5, SHA-1, SHA-256, SHA-384, and SHA-512. So the instance method is called compute hash. We can't use that because that's already the name of the instance method. And across 4 years, the best we came up with was get rid of the word compute.
Yep, I like it. Is there a static hash size on these so that you could initialize the destination bytes easily?
No, you're expected to know when you call them.
Yeah, I mean, SHA-256, it tells you in the name. It's whatever 256 divided by 8 is. 32? Yeah, 32.
I think we decided trying to do math today is a bad idea.
Sleeping is hard, okay? All right. So
Looks good to me.
cool. That was easy.
There was a question in chat. Why is this on the why are these static members on the types themselves instead of having a static method on hash algorithm that also takes a name as a parameter? So you would pass in hash algorithm name .SHA-256, .512, whatever, as an argument.
Yeah.
Coming from math and mathf, I don't like static helper classes.
Well, we already have hash algorithm name, and we already have hash algorithm. The only weirdness that would be on hash algorithm is that would no. So I don't like it on hash algorithm because there are types that derive from it, and people really like calling static methods on derived types. So someone will be like, they called. I mean, we can use new to mask it at the lower levels, but like if you could then do hmax SHA-256 dot hash, which looks like you're doing hmax SHA-256, but you're not. You're doing whatever the hash algorithm parameter is.
It also means that we would only be limited to the types that we know about. And if you wanted to define your own my custom hash type, you wouldn't be able to use the same pattern we did. You would have to literally define your own static helpers as we're doing here. Yeah. So this is probably the pattern we should just have people do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very reasonable question, but I think that the static or the derived type static invocation would lead to a lot of potential confusion, and that that this is a pattern that we can just follow, and that helper method is easy enough to write.
Does this issue also concern itself with HMAC or just with non-keyed hashing?
I did it with just non-keyed hashing because once you have an HMAC, you have the key, and now just create the instance.
Okay. Final question then. I assume if you pass a null byte array into the hash method, it throws an argument null exception?
Yeah, probably.
What if you pass a null read-only span of byte as opposed to an empty read-only span of byte?
That should work.
So remember, we did have an issue a few months ago where somebody was surprised that that they changed the call sites on some of the crypto APIs to go from byte array to read-only span of byte, and they started seeing incorrect behaviors because where they should have received an exception telling them you're doing something wrong, instead we computed cryptographic computations over empty inputs, which broke the security of their application.
Right, but
didn't we decide we're not going to make a distinction between read-only spans created from empty versus null? I think we just shouldn't be doing that.
Right. So the one that takes a byte will throw an ANE of you called the managed one and gave it nonsense. The span one, while I have written a few places that need to make a distinction because the underlying spec says there's a distinction between null and empty. The general rule we have is the span from null and span from empty are the same span. And
I agree with that rule, and I think we should follow that rule. What I'm trying to figure out, I guess, is there a pit of failure here potentially, where a developer is calling the API, they're incorrectly passing us null, not expecting us to treat it as a zero-length buffer? Like, is there something we can do to this API to make it more apparent that, like, hey, developer, we really anticipated you to pass in data here?
If they have a byte array, then they'll still get the argument, or they'll still get the null. Because if they have a byte array, they'll call the byte array overload and they'll get the exception. If they've already turned it into a span, that was on them.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I feel like we're being consistent with how we're using span elsewhere in the BCL.
Yeah.
So I guess one issue then is if I have a byte array and I call the hash overload that takes both a source and a destination, that is implicitly converted to span, which means that could mask nulls as a problem.
Yeah, but you're less. I mean, it's more advanced. You're probably. Yeah, I mean, there is a border distinction between the byte returning one and the destination writing one.
Okay, sure.
We can add other overloads to the destination writing one. I just think that we classically haven't, except for read-only-span of char with string.
Okay, no, that's fine. I just wanted to throw it out there. It sounds like consensus is it's not a realistic problem.
Okay. All right. So as the approved as proposed, this is the expanded definition. So as API review, I will mark it as approved. Then as feature owner, punt to future. Yes, Kevin, you're still allowed to do it right now if you want to. And it was important to have the API review discussion in case someone wanted to get it in 5. We're not committing to the feature in 5. For anyone who did differently in triage yesterday. All right. EnumMemberAttribute constructor. We have a value property and they want to make a value constructor parameter.
Are there any other properties on this type that are worth constructor as well?
Well, generally in an attribute, if something's a settable property, or if it's in the constructor, it's a get only property, and if it's a settable property, it's not in the constructor. But this would be, cause this is obviously backforming something, but
Is there a subject matter expert for this issue here?
it says serialization. I think that's you.
Oh. No, I'm just the guy removing it. I think you're the area owner.
I hope not. I feel like SRS is a specialized subcategory of system runtime. Hello, Emo.
Hello.
Oh, it's data contract serialization. Okay.
All right, so Emo, maybe you'll have some good opinions here. The proposal on the screen is we have the existing attribute EnumMemberAttribute. It takes value as a getSet property, and they want to add a constructor overload to accelerate setting the value. But I feel like we generally don't add those accelerators once the property has a setter.
I mean, it is a weird design, though, right? Like, I don't know why they did the property in the first place, but
I agree. So we can say that we're fixing it to what they should have done now.
I mean, the question really is like, what other properties does this thing have?
Is value set
It tells you if the
explicitly?
value setter, yeah, it tells you if the value setter was ever called.
Which must be get only? Yeah.
Because presumably setting it to null actually is interesting compared with it having its default value of null.
So what does it mean if you apply the attribute without passing anything to the constructor and not setting value?
No idea.
That doesn't mean that there's no value? Or does it just mean take the underlying value? That seems odd. And this
Mark
only
ready for
applies to
review.
what? Data contractualization or?
Yeah, so I'm looking through the full framework sources, and the only place that is value set explicitly is ever checked, is ever read, is to ensure that you did not set the value property to null or an empty string, which presumably the value setter could have checked.
Which would be the same as using the default constructor?
No, so they say if you set the one check that they perform is if you have set the value property, you did not set it to null or empty. But if you have never set the value property, they have a separate code path for that.
Where it's, what, figuring out value based on what you applied it to? Like, the question is, what does EnumMember with open square bracket EnumMember close square bracket do? They have a default constructor. It does something. But we classically, if I recall correctly, don't overload attributes, which is a redundant way of saying we don't backspill the settable properties into constructor parameters.
Sorry, what do you mean by we don't overload them? I mean, we certainly have overloaded constructors.
Okay. I feel like
attributes.
we generally try not to, but
I mean, that is true because we try to keep them simple, but like, I mean, there are plenty of examples where we have done that. Even though I can't think of one right now.
Yeah.
But I recently had this argument with Jan, I think, and I pointed out there's some very common one that do that.
Fair enough. I mean, like, aside from the fact that it's an attribute, and that means that now we would have a constructor parameter that corresponds to a settable property.
Yeah, I have no idea why they went with the property, because if you just look at the docs pages, they always set the property, which seems...
Yeah, I'm again looking through the source code. It looks like applying the attribute and not setting the value property does have a small side effect, but it's not something that it looks like most people would ever run into. It looks like setting the property. Setting the attribute and not setting the value property simply marks the thing as I am allowed to be serialized, even if, for whatever reason, WCF decides that this wasn't originally serializable.
Yeah, so like looking at the doc page for the details, it seems like not passing in any value is legal, and it means it's just serialized as the string of the EnumMember. But then what happens if you don't put EnumMember on the EnumMember? Does it mean it blows up at runtime and says you can't serialize that value?
No, they use the name of the member. Basically it's the same as not setting the value property at all. But there is an additional check such that, what is this? There is an additional check that says if if the field is not marked as serializable, but it has a value that is annotated with this attribute, serialize it anyway.
Which lets you have, like, 3 members of an enum be serializable with the others failing, I guess.
Yeah, like it seems like the root documentation has an example where one field does not have the attribute and it says not a serializable enumeration, and like it seems like if you do that it should blow up, or it should block deserialization at least or something. I don't know, like it seems highly confusing to me.
Yeah.
Like in general, I would assume if I mark the entire enum as data contract, then all values in that enum are serializable by default. And then EnumMember is only used to customize what it is serialized under. That would have made sense to me design-wise, but like I wasn't there when they designed it. I mean, in principle, like looking at the docs, it seems there is a distinction between setting and not setting, and so we need to preserve that. But overloading the constructor seems reasonable. The only downside with doing that after the fact is if people inspect the attribute using the static analysis thingy, right, where they don't actually instantiate the attribute, but they just look at the attribute construction, that caller has to handle now the constructor passed a string and value set to the string, right? It's now basically two ways you can configure that attribute. And unless you instantiate the attribute, you actually have to handle that in code, right? If the attribute is just instantiated, then it's fine because the constructor will set it, and then if they ask for the value, it will have the right value. Does that make sense? Or
right? So the complication. So the reason, yeah, because I found the guidelines finally. I think my cursor was on the page past them, so I had to search the whole book. Is do not provide constructor parameters to initialize properties corresponding to optional arguments, aka don't have a setter and a constructor parameter, and then the other one is avoid overloading custom attribute constructors. So
yeah, I mean, I think that
we have a do not for this scenario, which is probably the metadata reader gets very hard.
Yeah, if you do metadata, that's what I'm saying. Like, this is custom attribute data thing in reflection, right? That basically just tells you what the signature looked like, and yeah, that one has to handle now the two cases. I'm not sure that applies to data contextualization. I think they just literally instantiate the attribute, so it will probably just work regardless. But that's why I would be careful with doing it after the attribute already shipped.
Okay, so it sounds like this one is a no.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's what it is.
Also, keep in mind that if we did decide we want to approve this in the future, we should get the area owners to comment. The area owners so far doesn't look like have even looked at the issue.
Yeah, unless it is me and Joe, which means no one.
No, it's Hong and Steve.
Okay.
So do we actually care about data contextualization? Is that something we actively invest in, or is it also something that we don't recommend people using?
We actually have unit tests for this exact scenario.
For what scenario? The fact that there is no constructor that takes a string, or
the fact that you construct it and never set the value property.
Ah, interesting.
In fact, System.Text.JSON also honors that property, it looks like.
Jeez. Okay. Yeah, unless the area owner feels like this is a cool feature, I personally don't care one way or the other. I mean, on the surface it looks reasonable, right? It seems redundant to say value equals.
Yep. But apparently they thought it was important to make a distinction between the default one and having specified values. So,
yeah,
I would have done it as a default or I would have done it with overloading without a settable property, I think. But
yeah. So let me clarify a point I just made. System.Text.JSON actually does not honor this. The unit test I'm looking at is for Newtonsoft JSON.
Ah. In that case. The cool thing with mechanical keyboards is I can hear when it's happening.
All right, and it's not blocking, so just close. I don't have to say no a lot.
Yeah, I usually just close it. I mean, be nice in the comment, but yeah, other than that, that seems to be the process. You don't have a label for that.
Right. I guess. Yeah. Normal. Does anyone have any objections to my words here?
You have the best words, the biggliest words.
That goes into the show notes of today. Spicy.
Oh yeah, we're actually we're officially reviewing milestone 5 ready for review. No non-blocking. We're sort of caught up, Emo. I don't know where the proposal is in this. I guess up here.
Math1 has a method. Math2 should have a similar functionality. Just an API. Yeah, I think I know what the scenario here is. But I don't. I mean, this is one of those areas, like, did the area owner mark it ready for review? Who marked it ready for review?
Eric St. John.
In principle, I think it doesn't look bad. It seems in line with, what is the root type again? It's container configuration, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, configuration container.
It has all these things called with blah blah blah. What's funny is that it has this thing called with part.
Do you not have MEF in the database?
No, I
It's
do.
container configuration.
Yeah, it's container configuration. It's system composition.hosting. I'm looking at it right now, actually, in APIs.net. It's a bit weird that, like, naming wise, I would have expected something like with part. That seems more consistent. But with export. Yeah, I guess if Nick commented on it and he proposed it, I think that's probably the right terminology then.
Okay.
I mean, basically, the one thing with math is that basically the way this works is they call it exports because let's say you have a type called, my fancy string writer, and you usually don't want to export it under that type name. You usually export it as an I text writer or a text writer, whatever the base type is that you usually derive from. And so the idea would be when you say with instance, you would pass in the instance and you would also specify what is the actual thing you want to export it under. For, you would say, with instance text writer, and then you would say new my fancy text writer, right? And then the other overloads here, the text strings, are just because the way math works under the. I mean, should note that math v2 works under this cover the same way, but in math v1, all exports are effectively just strings, and so usually they're just a fully qualified type name. So I would basically go with the proposal that Nick has, which was the simple one, right? Yeah, he basically had the with export of T exported instance, contract name, and metadata as optional. And then he just has the equivalent of that is dynamically typed, right? So that you don't have to do generics. So that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I mean, the only, and maybe this is inherent to why you would want to do it. The only thing that really bothers me on this one is it's set up for generic inference, but that's exactly what you don't want if you're calling it. Because if you're calling it, you're wanting to change the wire type of the instance, but I don't. there's not really a good way to
disable
do that.
that.
But
I
if
mean,
you
I
call
would generally say
with
it's-
instance new example, then it's going to serialize it as example. I mean, certainly I guess the method could throw if thing.getType is equal to texport or type of texport.
But it's not always a bug, right? So, for example, like I just recently wrote an ASP.NET app, and with the DI system, it's the same pattern, right? You say add, what is it? Add what is it? I forgot what the name is. Basically add a service, right? And then you can type it under a different thing, and that's the same pattern. You just have to specify the type name in that case.
Well, but in that case, generic inference is fine. If you were instantiating the type that you want, then it works, and if you didn't, then things explode mightily. And if this will explode mightily, then fine, and probably fine anyways. It's just it's weird that the exact time that you want to use this method, you don't want generic inference to work.
Yeah, that's true. Although, like, yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like, I mean, if you actually have a service, like in my case, that is not based on an abstraction, it's literally just the service, because all I want is just a global thing I want to import, I actually don't have a base type. So in this case, generic inference actually was helpful. But I would agree in general, you want to have an explicit type there.
Because the only time I can think of that you would want the type, that it would be, like, I can think it would be okay for the type to match if what you're doing is taking a T export from somewhere, and you're saying always write this down as the base class. And if the base class was instantiable, then you could end up with, I didn't give you a specialized form, just serialize it as is. So maybe it makes sense, but it's an API that the only success, the ideal time you want to use it, based on what I understand, is you don't want, or generic inference is wrong. On the other hand, this does stop you from passing a nonsense combination of a type object and an instance. So
right.
So it gives you some compiler sanity on your call. So yeah, if you think,
I mean, that seems like if you really cared, I mean, that would be a fine example of an analyzer, right, where you would say you probably didn't mean to use generic inference here.
Yeah. Yeah, because pretty much any time that you didn't specify the type name with this method, it would be probably a bug. So, okay, so you think the names look methy?
Yes. So I would just say I would extract the extension methods as Nick wrote them, not what's in the proposal. So let me just comment on this. I'd go with
with export of T instead of with instance.
Yeah, basically paste it in. It would be just instance method on the container configuration that would return a new. I actually don't know whether it returned this or a new instance, but basically the same signatures, right? Except that it's not extension methods. I think the terminology export makes more sense.
Yeah, it seems to be consistent with other terminology already used by Meth, just from reading the issue description.
And I mean, Nick Blumhardt wrote the whole thing, right? So like, I would just trust his gut on that.
Okay. But he had suggested it as extensions, and you think it should just be instance methods?
Well, I think he wrote it as extensions because
he wrote it in a demo project. Okay.
Yes, exactly. So that was just more like.
So his was an FII. Okay. I mean, you could have just pushed the approve button there, Emo. It's not like it knows.
Well, no, I just wanted. I mean, it's just my low-level way of sharing my screen, right? Posting, commenting.
Fair enough.
I would probably change T to T export because it matches the API that's on with part, which takes T part instead of T.
And I'd probably flip these two arguments.
Sorry, I can't see what you're doing right now.
I agree. Yeah, type and object should be flipped because you want the type to be the first thing across both the generic and the non-generic.
Yeah, the non-generic one, essentially the generic one, then it looks like you're calling the non-generic one, but you have compiler safety instead of just whatever runtime behavior you get when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense. Because the other one wouldn't compile, right? If you accidentally passed it.
And so, while on the one hand it means that the first argument isn't always the exported instance, it's when you read it left to right, it's with export a type name, then an instance, then an optional contract name. So we do have 2 optional parameters here. Does that mean that we want the simplified overloads that don't have optional parameters?
Good question. What does MEF do in general? Do they actually... I think MEF v2 is also generally overloaded, yes. They don't seem to do optionals.
I was just going to say they probably predated us accepting optional parameters, generally. And
yeah, I mean, that was done before we had optional guidance.
Right.
That's why most of the... I mean, his extension methods, he didn't care, right? He just wanted to only type it once.
Sure. I'm just the guidance that we wrote in the book is once you have 2 or more, you should consider adding the simpler ones so that there's the view that doesn't show a bunch of square braces in IntelliSense.
Yeah, I would probably just do one overload that just doesn't have any optionals, and then one that basically has...
Yeah, that's the guidance.
Yeah, that seems... Yeah, I guess... Yeah, it's fine. Hold on. Where's my window? I lost the window.
Sorry, just to confirm, you're saying have an overload that contains neither of the optionals and have an overload that contains both, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's...
So I pasted it in. It's a bit nonsensical that you now effectively, if you only pass the first 2, they're logically both applicable, right? But the compiler will prefer the actual overload. But it basically allows you to pass in the metadata without passing in the contract name. Which is better than having 3 overloads.
Right, and changing all the T's to T exports. Okay.
I think I did that already. No, I pasted it over again, I guess.
I missed one. If I'd been smart, I would have just copied export, pasted that instead of needing to highlight the T. But right, so that's... I think you and I have the same thing, except mine says T export now.
Yeah, we should swap the type names, right? If you didn't do that already.
I did. Oh yeah. So I fixed. So it's type, comma instance. And then I guess we're doing presumably the nullable annotations form of this is these are obviously nullable and the exported instance is not, because exporting null is probably not good and the type is required.
I would agree with that. Is MEF already annotated? If so, then yeah, let's mark them.
All right.
Yeah, exporting null seems bad. I don't think that's legal.
All right. Any other things people see that's wrong here? Which will look exactly like Emo's thing and just in another bubble.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. Yay! One more API approved. Are you sorting by oldest to newest?
Yeah.
Interesting, because I think we... Did we already decide what to do for extend process start info?
Reviewed this one.
Oh, you look at the file. I see, that's why.
Yeah, things that are marked as 5 seem more than things that are floating. So.
Right.
I pinged David. We'll see if he is here.
Oh, right. And then on that previous one, I'll add the note that says that we also consider it valuable for a analyzer that finds when generic inference was used.
Okay, I'm against this API. We should not do it.
You're trying to beat David Fowler's.
I tried to start the conversation at an interesting angle, I guess.
I feel like, didn't we review this API and reject it and wait for David to provide more?
Let me check.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, we rejected it.
So
And
what
then he
was
said-
his feedback that caused it to be reopened?
Hey, David
Ooh.
joined.
Oh,
It's yes, we do.
at the freaking API, man. What's going on? Oh, I didn't understand why you guys didn't want to do this because of the allocation. We do it everywhere else.
So that was the discussion we had last time. So like originally Jesus. I think originally I said we should do it, and then people talked me out of it.
Oh,
And the argument was that this API will allocate on your behalf, which is surprising on the SequenceReader API. And you're saying
Super
there's
agree.
other APIs already that do that?
they all do that, yeah. Yeah, I don't disagree, but this API is super useful, and the other ones do the same thing already.
Yeah, to me, and that's kind of what I said as well. Like, to me, it's kind of like, what would a person do otherwise, right? And the argument was, well, use the other APIs, do the stack alloc yourself, and if you don't like the stack alloc, then, go to
Yeah.
the buffer pool yourself or whatever. But like, that I can see this being boilerplate, right?
It's inconvenient as hell, yeah. And yeah, I mean, basically all the code has to do it at the call site. It's kind of the hard part, right? Stack out some size, and if it's bigger than that, then rent from the pool, and then do the whole
I
thing.
mean, the only
Do
thing is
that.
like, do you have an extension method today that you basically wrote yourself that does that?
Yep. Well, that does what this does. Not stack out because you can't stack
Yeah.
out in
Right. I mean,
So,
you could
yeah.
pass in a span of temp space that the caller used as the stack alloc that gets used if it fits, and
yeah, and you'd always have to allocate it on the stack because you couldn't like do the if first and see if the size was small enough to then do that. Right.
makes your
Yeah, I mean, the,
stack overflows more predictable.
Exactly right.
I mean, predictable is better than non-predictable.
Well, it's a good
I mean-
thing no one uses this in a loop.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, like, if we do this, like, if you already have an extension method that's the same thing, the risk is low. My only concern is we give you this API, and then you update all your call sites, and then 2 months later we get this, bang email that says, oh my God, we just regressed the Kestrel performance on a hot path. That's, that would then come back to, like, we told you so kind of thing, right? But yeah, I mean, I agree, generally speaking, that if an allocation happens rarely enough, then it probably doesn't matter. And
Yeah,
this seems
I
to
mean,
be
and-
one of those
yeah.
cases where it's probably rare because your buffers are large enough.
Right. And I think I guess it depends on how long your tokens are. That it may or may not matter. Because the alternative is you slice first, and then you call TryReadTo, but you still need to do the whole like slice, create a sub sequence reader, and then call like try get span or whatever. So it's all kind of painful.
Right.
So what is your general like approach then? Something like you'd search for a semicolon and then you say, okay, now pass this stuff off to the header parser, and it's just the span that represents the header until the semicolon.
Yep. Yeah, so I had been writing a bunch of parsers to try to find the most optimal way to use Sequence Reader, and the fastest thing to do is to get a span. Keeping the sequence around is good for not allocating, but it's really chunky and hard to use, right? So you kind of want to find the block of memory you want quickly, and then turn it into a span, and then parse.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
pattern
just
seems to be the one that's most optimal.
yeah, I mean, but just speaking the other side of it, so we make sure that we're happy
Yep.
with the decision. if you're using the sequences, it seems like you're generally trying to avoid allocations and be willing to write more code to avoid doing allocations. And while a 1T delimiter is probably, or means that you'll always get a span allocated. I mean, I guess that's not true. If it was found 3 pages later, you're going to allocate a copy of 3 pages.
Yep.
But something like the PIM footer, where in certificate plus 10 hyphens is, I'm going to just say like 18 characters long.
Yep.
That's even itself likely to now be complicatedly on a straddle, and so
Agreed.
you're going to end up doing a lot of allocations in a thing that you've already written a bunch of code to not allocate. But if that's what all the other convenience methods are doing, then
Yeah.
that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and that one is interesting. So the PEM thing, we're scanning for the end sequence. In that case, you could easily avoid the allocation, and I get the surprise. I think this is more for smaller tokens where you don't expect to actually end up having giant blobs between the beginning and end of where you're searching. So header segments are less likely to have that same issue. But I get the API generally can put you into a place where you may end up allocating a big thing because you thought it was convenient to use this API.
Right. Because if the behavior on everything that was these TryReadTo was, it's false if it's not found or the first occurrence is, or if it's not found in the first page, right? If I will give you the span, or it's not found in a single, like that's where it gets all weird.
Yeah.
If false starts becoming ambiguous, but really it's, I'm telling you false because someone needs to allocate something,
Yep.
or it's completely not found.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, if that's what they're doing, it's what they're doing. The feedback before was it feels like this is just setting you up for, you wrote a lot of code to avoid allocations, and maybe it's allocating every time you called it.
Yeah, I mean, I was torn initially, but the alternative is this thing either uses the pool and then you're fraught with lifetime issues, because then who calls return? And when do you call it? Do you always call it, or do you call it if your span that was returned is wrapped by a pooled arrays? It's all messy, so this seemed like the best of all worlds.
So just to clarify, like you can write this as an extension method today, correct?
Yeah.
Because there is a TryReadTo that returns a sequence.
Correct.
Are you using that extension method today in your own internal stuff?
Yeah. Well, in Kestrel, no. Somewhere else, yes.
So you anticipate that if we add this API, you would consume it pretty much immediately?
Yeah. Yeah. It came out of a discussion. Well, two things. I have been writing code to find the best way to use this parser, and then someone had tried to convert their own code using arrays to use the sequence reader, and they were complaining about a lack of API like this. I think the proposal was for a get span from read-only sequence itself, and then we were playing with it, and then it turned out that this was the better API to have. I still want the advanced too. I think that one got punted, or it was called set position because it was kind of awkward.
All right, so it sounds like even though the API has a non-zero pit of failure, people want it. So
Yeah.
Do we
It's
really
the
want
same
to?
that already exists. So you were saying, Nemo?
Do we really want to add the bool like this though? Like that seems.
The bool,
It
Yeah.
has
You mean
symmetry.
advanced pass. Yeah, I mean,
All of the other TryReadTo APIs have
yes.
it. Advanced
they do.
pass delimiter equals true.
Oh, they all have that. Okay, that's.
Yeah, it's symmetry.
Yeah. I mean, if in the future we can think of a way to pass an allocator or give it to the sequence reader, that would be an interesting compromise where in these methods you give the reader an allocator or I don't know, a pool. And
The
then
problem with an allocator is that it doesn't really help you with like stack alloc because you can't indirect that shit.
I know. Yeah, that is the messiest part, to be honest.
I mean, having an indirection for stack-alloc would be nice, but I don't know how we would do that. Like that, but that's the general problem that we have with these APIs is that you'd like to have them policy-free so you can, but that makes them slightly less usable.
I would actually push back against an accelerator for that because it would make it extraordinarily common for people to write this inside of a loop and then Stack Overflow.
Well, it doesn't have to be trivial, right? It just means like right now it's not doable, right? You basically have to bake that policy into every single API. But you basically have to provide an API such that somebody can do stack-alloc on the call side, and that indirection makes the signatures fairly unwieldy.
Sure, and it sounds like it can be done with a little bit of contortion because it is possible to write an extension method that is the API that's being proposed here.
Yeah.
And if you have that extension method, then you can build one that works with stack-alloc under the covers.
Yeah, I guess you can. I mean, the problem is making that generic would be hard, right?
Sure.
Basically,
So
it would have to be
yeah.
a
So
hard-coded
as
size.
as a straw man, you have TryReadTo that takes a destination span, which is your scratch buffer, basically, and TryReadTo also returns a span, which is here's where I actually put the data, which could point to the scratch buffer, or it could just point to what was already in the read-only sequence and be copy-free.
That was one of the original designs we had for Peak, I think,
Yeah.
or Try Peak. We pass in a buffer. And then we were talking about maybe it should be lazy, so it should be a func, but then that doesn't work for stack-alloc.
It doesn't need to be a func. Like you can pass in a stack-alloc buffer as a scratch buffer. It's just the
Yeah.
method's not guaranteed to write to it. The
But you
method's
always have to
guaranteed
allocate it.
return a buffer.
That's the issue, right?
That's okay because you do it once at the beginning of the method and it's generally pretty short, like say maybe 512 bytes. Like the overhead of that's actually not too bad.
You sure? I would
It
turn
would
off
have to be
it
at the beginning of
in
the
it
method.
locals. Make it faster.
Sure, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, like that. Yeah, you probably have to do that. But I mean, other than that, it's just a pointer decrement, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what that size boils down to. So I mean, unless you have stack issues, I don't think lazy stack-alloc buys you much.
I don't know. We pay a lot for zeroing the sequence reader memory. It's actually super expensive in Castro.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the init thing I buy, but that's even in the lazy case, you probably want to avoid that cost, right?
Yeah.
So the signature on this is all busted because outs go after all other parameters, but it matches.
API, yeah.
It
Why is
matches
it that way?
all.
Yeah,
keys,
yeah,
so.
yeah. I copied. Did you guys review the first? I mean, you were all there when this happened, right? The first one.
I did not review Sequence Reader.
You probably did, but like there were too many iterations. I don't remember that.
Yeah, it was. Sorry, never mind.
It's the quirkiest API I think we have so far.
Yeah.
In this
It
space.
solves a very specific problem.
Yeah, I think I've seen pieces of it before, but like the original version appeared, I don't know, while I was on vacation or something.
Yeah, this I think Pavel and Christoph designed this by yelling at each other, and I think that's the outcome that we have here.
Yeah.
But like yeah, it's probably not the easiest API we have, but that's also why I don't care so much about accelerators here, because convenience all up here is not.
Right. So yeah, given that there's already these other two TryReadTos that are outing the span and allocating, and this one's just adding the one that takes that the delimiter is not a single T but a span of T.
Right.
Seems okay. There's a footnote that says that we also declined this API for being a complicatedly allocate.
Does it? This one, let me think. The second one doesn't allocate. The first one does.
Yeah. How we rejected the read-only-span version for the same reason. So presumably we approved this one as sequence only.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
This one was for a read. Oh, try read exact. That name is better than my name.
Yeah.
But I would want it for the same reason as the other one. The API is like gonna allocate it randomly. I like it, especially if count is small, like 2. And I do think in the future, maybe what Levi said we should consider, like different APIs that maybe do weird shit, like taking a scratch based on return. That one is more fine. I'm worried about people passing in like a pooled array, I guess. And I guess that's I don't know.
I mean, reading into the pooled array, then using your data and
guess it's
returning
fine.
it is fine. You know the scope of when you're reading it.
Yeah, you're a leaf function. As a leaf function, we don't really care about lifetime issues.
I guess if rent and return are pretty cheap, isn't that bad?
Because for something like header processing, if you're doing a header and then moving on and a header and moving on, you would just use the same scratch buffer over and over and over again. You've read it, you've done what you needed to do, you've either sent it to an output stream or done your logic, and now you're moving on to the next one.
The issue is like you're trying to not allocate at all, right? So you're reading, you aren't trying to copy, you're just trying to get the span of what makes a header in the first place.
Yeah. The funny thing about headers is the fastest way to interpret them is actually going to be not to use sequence reader at all, but rather to say, like, just read the first 4K of the incoming request, put it into a single contiguous buffer, and then parse it.
Yep.
See, we don't copy. We only copy if we need to. And since we have 4K buffers anyway, so Kestrel reads 4K, right? And you have 4K chunks, so you read 4K at a time, and you parse whatever you can as spans, and then only when you get on the boundary do you go to the slow path. So it's fast until you hit the edge, and then you go slow. And
in these cases, you wouldn't be using sequence reader at all. You would just be using UTF-8 parser or whatever API you need.
We use sequence reader to get the extent of like the line, for example, and then we parse the span from there.
But sequence reader can't operate over spans. Sequence reader requires an array.
No, it returns spans.
Yes, sorry, I thought you were saying you wrapped a sequence reader around an existing span. Okay, got it.
No. Yeah. I think the goal of this type is to go from chunky to more fine grained, to zoom in and then parse.
So approve?
All right. Yeah! So the TryReadTo that is just adding, like, because the existing TryReadTos that are outing spans already have the allocating problem. This one potentially makes it worse because the delimiter itself can now be straddling a page boundary. But
so I think in the future, if we do choose to solve it, maybe the scratch buffer is the right API design for that one.
Sure. I mean, the implementation of this won't be too bad. The implementation of this can be written as an extension method in like 4 lines of code. So, whatever.
Call the sequence one.
And call the sequence one is the sequence a single span, return its unread span, otherwise call to array and return it.
Yep. Of course, then you're using the sequence through the return, which is, I think, what it's trying to avoid, but still, that's plumbing details now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so since this issue called out revisiting this one, I still think that new API shouldn't make the mistakes of the past, and that we should continue. Like, we already had the overloads. Like, we're adding an overload to a thing that already has a problem. I really think that we shouldn't be adding more pits of failure to this type.
I had a scenario here. So like this one was because, what was it for? It's specifically, this one was about reading like, was it like prefix-based lengths, like length-based prefix systems? TryRead count. Like this came from here it is. Here, yeah, it's right. It's right here. It's right here. Yeah. So the example is a prefix length payload. And the code you want to write is TryRead length from the byte array. So you read like a big Endian integer, and then you want to read that many bytes from a sequence. as a span.
Right. Though in your proposal, you only used it as a sequence.
Yeah. Jesus. What did I do? Yeah. But yeah, I mean, yeah.
Again, but like in this exact trap,
that isn't
or
that
in
bad.
this exact scenario, right? Like you're using it as a read string, and you're like, oh, I can easily convert a read-only span of char, or a read-only span of byte into a string by going through encoding. So I'm going to use try read whatever the passed-in length was out to a span. It's like, okay, well, it turns out this was War and Peace, so it's taking your sequence of 900 pages of
Yep.
of 10K memory, and okay, let's go build one giant contiguous buffer to pass it in. That's probably not what you wanted.
So the thing is, SequenceReader is inconvenient to use, and read-only sequence is inconvenient to use, and SequenceReader was the solution for that. So the question becomes, like, when you've narrowed down your search to find the set of bytes you want, what do you do next? So in this case, right, let's say I have this buffer. If I want to parse it further, I now have to create a new SequenceReader over that subbuffer, right? So so there is this edge where you kind of fall off a cliff, and spans are easy because spans are contiguous and everything supports them. When you have a sequence, you're trying to narrow you're trying to narrow the search to get a span or a subsequence, and then do more parsing.
Right. Well, I mean, the easy answer when you get the sequence is payload dot give me the span if you're a single span, because I know it's there somewhere. Like, it's probably a couple lines of code. You get the single span if it's a single span, or to array, which is exactly what the overload's going to do, but you're going to see the call to array in your code.
Yeah, but that code, so we have that code in Kestrel, right? That code is everywhere. Everyone has that get to buffer or not. And we even thought about adding a method to read-only sequence that was like to array maybe, to array sort of, possibly to array. Like, that might be a better solution for this stuff. Because it would give you a span back, but it would give you a span that maybe is a copy or maybe isn't a copy. And it has the same problem, but now it's on the core type.
Right. Well, I mean, presumably you would end up with, two contiguous memory with an optional allocator, but
yeah, exactly.
Now we're C with passing allocators around. So.
Yeah. So I think for me, this comes down to, like, what is the thing you're returning when you call try read and you get some sub payload that you're gonna further parse. What do you do from there? Because I could create a second sequence reader and do more parsing, and the perf is garbage, just because this thing is heavy to create.
Right, but you can just say if reader try read, and then you just immediately do payload to array, and yeah, you're making copies in small things, but that's if you want the easier looking code instead of the better performance. Like, calling the one that outs a span is worse performance.
Well, it's sometimes worse performance. Yeah, that's the key, right? So, like, for the most part, if you use pipelines and you use this, it won't allocate unless you hit a boundary, which by default is how big are the arrays? I think it's 4K at least by default. So I guess yeah, go ahead.
Is the scenario reading small tokens from the payload? Because that's what's in the example here. Like, if the scenario is to read small tokens, like 32-bit integers from the payload, then we don't need the try read that outs a span, but the try read that outs a sequence would be useful.
I
think the point is, if it's small, you're probably not going to get an allocation, and in the rare case that the 4 bytes straddle a boundary, you're like, whatever, just do it. The problem is...
I guess what I'm doing is I'm thinking of, like, what would the implementation of try read big endian look like? Like, the implementation would say, take the unread span, try calling binary primitives try read.
No.
If that succeeds, return it.
It was slice first. Slice 4 bytes.
No, you don't need to do that. Binary primitives doesn't require that.
I know, but you would slice first.
No, you wouldn't.
Why not?
Because if you get the unread first span from whatever is left in the sequence, binary primitives will attempt to read 4 bytes from it. If it returns false, then you say try read that returns the out sequence. If that returns false, fail.
See,
And if that returns
no.
true, then binary primitives.
This isn't that. This is basically trying to. It reads the length first, and then it tries to read that many bytes from the sequence.
Right, I'm only talking about the
I see.
implementation of try-read big endian.
I see. Okay, got it.
The implementation of that, I wouldn't use the first overload, but I would use the second.
Of
Okay.
how it would internally be
Yeah.
implemented.
Yeah.
Well, really, it would just probably take sequence dot give me the current span. Is its length bigger than 4? Yay, pass that
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
try read
exactly.
big endian. So it's never going to call try read count anyway. It's just going to look at the next at the current position 0.
Yeah, it would call try-read count only in the slow path.
Yeah. Yeah, my personal feeling here is that the one that outs a span should be deferred until the allocator problem is solved, and that should be true for all net new method groups on SequenceReader. Personally.
I kind of agree.
I mean, so like,
I think someone did the math and kind of calculated the probability of allocating based on buffer size, and it was
amazing.
very, very small. I think it was like in the single digit percentages for most buffer sizes.
Right, but if the thing that you're doing here with parse is reading a B-stir, like, while the average value of that length is going to be 60, the big theta of that is pages and pages that you're now concatenating together into a single temporary array in a thing that looks like it's non-allocating.
Yeah, that's
So,
reasonable.
I mean, so if you added the span one, then I would have it do something like throw as soon as you pass in bigger than 1,000, and.
I mean, you could. I mean, if you want to throw, I don't know.
Well, you called tried read.
Right?
Yeah, you called tried read count, or sorry, tried read exact of more than a k, and it's like out to a span, and it's like, nope, that's too big. I refuse to do it.
Though, right? So, like, I mean, to really destroy the performance, you need to allocate something huge.
But like whatever the number, like I would want it to be
some big ass number. Yeah, I get it.
throwing to tell me you're doing this wrong, like.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then we would debate on that, and so that's why I think we should wait until allocator is solved. Of what do you want me to do when I can't give it to you from existing contiguous memory.
But by the way, like that, the allocator doesn't solve it either, right? Like nothing solves this. Just so we know, like at some point you're gonna have an issue with a single contiguous buffer, and even the pool, even the array pool maxes out at 2 megs, right, per buffer.
Right.
So at some point you're gonna need chunks, and the only question becomes like, what is our model for doing this kind of computation? Do you want to do we recommend getting a second sequence reader from this sequence and doing further parsing, or do you, like, I don't know?
I mean, so in that model, let's assume that it takes a sequence reader allocator and it has try allocate of a size, and you passed in one that refuses to go above 2 meg because that's what the array pool effectively limits itself to. And then it would be, well, allocate returned false, so try read exact returns false. So now you call the sequence one, and now you decide what you want to do with it. You can call to array and let it allocate contiguously, but if you were going to do that, you would have just made your your allocator be new array. And
yeah, I get that. Well, I guess what I'm saying is we need to add more APIs that take read-only sequence if we don't do things that take span. If we don't want to expose things that return span here, then we have to expose APIs that take sequence reader.
That's a no from me.
Right. So exactly. So the alternative becomes we should expose spans or tell everyone to do to array, which is bad for performance, or we expose more things that understand the sequence and then do loops under the covers.
Maybe,
or at least in very specific cases. Then
I just so my feeling on it is think you acknowledged that it would be nice if there was an allocator model where someone could control what happens when it crosses boundaries.
Yes.
So, and the moment we add one of those, we would add an analyzer that says, you called the one that didn't specify an allocator, you're doing it wrong, switch to the new one. Because even if you want the...
I don't think we would do that.
Okay.
We might have this like a, consider, but it certainly would, like, there are plenty of situations where someone's using this thing and they don't care about a tiny allocation once in a blue moon, and they're not going to bother.
Right.
Fair enough. Okay.
So it feels like the trade-off here to me is the BCL has a ton of span APIs for very small, for reasonably small counts. This works well, right? And it allocates rarely. And we don't really understand the guidance for what happens when the count. So if you end up having to call a thing that takes spans, and you call to array, you're in the same boat that you would have been if you called try_read_exact passing in the span in the first place. All right. So it feels to me like I don't know how to rationalize those two things.
Well, because the other one would be try_read_exact that takes a span to fill. And then now you've solved both problems. Like, yes, it's always copy and never slice, but it's the where does the memory come from if I have to straddle pages? Oh, this one. Like
then I'd call that try copy to or something like that, or try
copy exact. Or,
try copy exact, yeah.
But it's, I mean, so if really this is, without being anyone who's ever used the type, I see what it is that it says it's trying to solve, and then what the APIs that are proposed and what they have to be doing, and either like I could understand it if they return false, if I can't give you a slice, like try read exact outing the span, you're like give me 4K and it's like I can't because it's not in the next page, or it's not, I don't have that much left in this page. You need to do something more complicated now. And so I can understand it if it does that. But the ones that are just silently allocating feels like you do all this work to switch your stuff to sequences, and now it's not helping as much. It's definitely not helping as much as you think it is, and that it may have invalidated all of your work.
Right, but the trade-off there, I think, is you use this thing to find narrower buffers so you can avoid how often it allocates. Like, that is a trade-off, because the code complexity of trying to parse a sequence by itself, like, is just harder. Depending on how the parser is written, obviously, but we basically have chosen to not add this type everywhere in the BCL, and span is that type. So the question is, what is the fastest way to narrow down this type to get a span for some subset of buffers, of bytes, of T's, I guess?
Is the problem we're trying to work around here that we want to be able to pass in a temporary working space of some sort, but we need like a try-bool return for no this didn't exist in the initial thing, or no, your temporary space doesn't have enough room either?
You're trying to avoid copies in the very common case when you're for example, like try read could be like, I don't know, some length prefixed message, right? And maybe your system has a setting that says max buffer size is 4K or 2K, who knows? And I have 4K buffers. I know for the most part, if I allocate, it's going to be some rare case, right? And my code could even throw before calling try read. So I know that, like, if what the person passed me is over that length, I can just throw an exception. I feel like in that case, you don't mind the occasional allocation, and the code is simple. You call try read, you get a span back, and then you call like get string. The alternative is they have to call try read, get a sequence, and then do value is single span, dot first span, otherwise to array, everywhere.
And what about try read exact count, comma, span of T, scratch, though let's please come up with a better name for that, comma,
Yeah.
out read-only-span of t value, which is fine. We can even say if for some reason you passed in a scratch space that's less than count, either that's an argument exception, or then it'll allocate a new thing. I'd probably go for an argument exception because obviously
I'd
it's
go
not
for
doing what you think
argument
it's doing
exception
now.
as well.
I like scratch space. I just don't want it to be the only API. Because it breaks the flow, right? Because imagine you're typing a bunch of like code in sequence. You now have to declare a span somewhere else to get passed in here.
I mean, if you think that it's valuable, so again, just brainstorming.
Yeah.
If we added int span out read only span,
Yep.
and then you wanted to say, but most people are going to be okay with I promise I'm passing small numbers, and if you need to allocate a 16-byte array, I don't care.
Exactly.
With adding the other one, it feels like we need to give someone the way that's not potentially creating big numbers. As a surprise.
I like having both.
I think
both of them.
Parsing is you're constantly having to guard against these large numbers and things. I don't know if saving someone on this one specific API is going to be significantly helpful to anyone trying to write a robust parser.
No, but this at least this pattern, if we want to say that instead of trying to figure out the allocator, we add overloads that take a scratch space. That is one alternative, right?
Yeah, this is really it. I mean, it's not so much about this method; it's about figuring out how do we lessen the pit of failure and make a pattern going forward that is sustainable.
Right. So yeah, that part I like. So I like having an alternative. So like the current ones allocate in rare cases. If you want to avoid it in all cases, then you have to own the memory before you call the method, which is a little bit unfortunate, but there's no way to fix that. And it can either be a stack out memory or it can be array pool or whatever, but you own that memory. And the return value is either a result of it's either that memory or is from the sequence reader itself. So you may copy, but that seems like a reasonable alternative. So you'd add overloads for all the try reads that have this scratch space. That takes spans. And that would kind of indicate to you that the one that doesn't have this, well, allocates.
And that would be you are saying like if it goes over this scratch space, we're returning false.
No, I think if count exceeds scratch.length, you throw. You obviously don't know what you're doing.
Okay.
Well, for this API, but for the other APIs, I would say, I guess it would always throw.
Yeah, we can't have false meaning not enough buffer space and the thing doesn't exist in the original sequence.
So question, does that make it hard to use?
You would only want to use that particular overload if you were reading a known small-ish amount of data. Like, say that I'm reading a GUID from the stream. Like, I know for a fact, like, stack allocating 16 bytes, for instance, is not going to be the end of the world.
Yeah. So if it was like the B-stir of the thing that could potentially have been War and Peace, but is probably a sentence. You would have read the count. If the count is less than some threshold I'm willing to deal with here, then try read exact into possibly using some scratch space. Otherwise, okay, this is really ugly. I really do want the sequence now. Like this is too big.
Interesting. So spicy questions that I have for you guys. Like, is there any precedent for using different data types that should maybe be int, maybe a short, to indicate that this is really for smaller buffer sizes? Is that a thing?
Not really, because int and long are the two numeric types that are easiest to use in the framework. Once you start dealing with short byte, s byte, like you have to start casting everywhere, and casting can mask problems because it's normally unchecked.
So to me, try count feels like if you were to pass in a number that was over, I don't know, pick a big ass number. I don't know, like something that seemed it would like it would really hurt performance. I could see throwing, but it's kind of we don't do it anywhere else, so it feels odd to do it in this one API. Your perf just gets worse.
Yeah, I wouldn't. The whole scratch thing, like I wouldn't recommend that most people do that, to be honest, because it is, you know, a complexity that most people don't need to deal with. I'm just thinking about cases where people need people really need to avoid allocations for whatever reason. They're inside of a crazy hot code path. At that point, maybe having these ancillary APIs are useful.
I mean, reading a page of tweets where you know that they're all bounded, right? You'd start with your scratch space that's big enough, and then you would just, while processing them all, read them all using this is the temporary space if you need to allocate something if I happen to straddle a page boundary, right? Like.
So I think it can't throw then. I think it has to I think the scratch space has to be a hint, or maybe a best effort, and if you exceed the scratch space, it then does to array, so it can still allocate.
Maybe it's just you controlled both arguments at that point, so
yeah,
you could have
exactly.
You could have seen, wait, this is bigger than my scratch space. Call the one that doesn't take it or something, but it does mean that the overload's a little weird because one of them gets infinite scratch space and the other one gets finite scratch space. But
yeah,
so I mean, the something taking scratch space feels at least like enough of an out or enough of a like there's the subtle extra complexity suggested to you that like you should at least stop and think maybe this isn't what I want always.
I like it. Yeah, we had the same discussion when we first did it, and then we kind of said, yeah, it's kind of complex because of the whole stack-alloc dance that you can't do here. You can't hide it basically. The caller has to do stack-alloc, and then if it's too small, do the whole like rent from a pool style thing. So you could only really use this if it didn't throw, and if you knew it was within some smallish range for stack-alloc. So I like this idea. So should we have an issue that just says, so forget this one method, but for all the methods, and it doesn't have to be in this release if we don't get to it, but can we agree that we think this pattern could be used across the type?
I think it's a pattern that could be easily used across SequenceReader. I don't know that there would be a whole lot of other places we would use it because not a lot of places are producing spans, but it's certainly a pattern I've used in helper methods of I stack alloc in the caller, pass you probably need to do a complicated thing in the middle. Here's your working space. And then just reuse the same working space over and over and over again. But yeah, like I like that it suggests to someone there's more complexity going on than you may be giving consideration to.
Yeah, I do question like so I want this API. What happens if the scratch space is too small? Forget count. If we did like try read span taking in a delimiter and you pass in scratch space, do you think it would throw or do you think it would return false? Maybe false. Because it couldn't fill the scratch space.
Right,
or
because
do you
have to
false
return
being
the
ambiguous.
Well, so
operation status.
The answer from
operation status, right?
Yeah, the answer from false. A try method, if it returns false, you should have a clear course of action. And if the clear course of action from the one that outs a span is to call the one that outs a sequence, that's a clear course of action. So false, like we simplify it to say it's single purpose, but Christoph expanded it once as single recovery. And
single recovery, okay.
That what you wouldn't want to do more complicated things, like you shouldn't then need to have effectively re-implemented the method yourself to figure out what false meant and what you need to do about it. So it's either one simple thing, or we think that 99.9% of people are all going to write this exact same thing in the false case of, oh, go call the sequence one, or whatever. So the try read 2 saying false was I couldn't find it, or the first one I found I couldn't copy into the scratch space, or wasn't already in a contiguous buffer. Like, you would have the sequence one will tell you if, like, you can move on there. It's like, try read without allocating something, false. Oh, try read maybe with allocating something, or try read, give me the sequence because I understand life is hard. Like,
All right, let me propose one more thing then, since we have infinite time here.
right.
Um,
Because there are negative 14 minutes left, so yeah.
Oh, sure, are we over? Okay, you're right, actually. If we had the sequence overload, and we had a way to get a span from a sequence, if we put all the onus on the read-only sequence to get a span from that, what would you call the method to return either not a copy or a copy? And would you have it be the same kind of pattern as this? Because maybe then we could just say, okay, get a sequence, and then when you want to span, you do sequence dot blah 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 dot method, and that could be an out for like this whole pattern.
I mean, like, you could have sequence dot, because the sequence will already tell you its length, right? That's
right.
a O1, not a O pages.
Yep. Right.
So it can out a sequence, and then you could have, sequence, dot either make contiguous or try make contiguous or whatever, and then you can give it scratch space for write to here if you need to, otherwise give me just the span slice that, like, that does the, oh, I'm just a single, I'm a sequence wrapping a single span, I'll just give you the span, and otherwise you give me a place that I can copy to.
So we have to array, which is the typical copy.
But that's the always allocate.
Yeah, we could do as array or not.
Yeah, well, because I mean, a thing that I do think is valuable is if you end up with the 5T sequence, and you're like, I really want this to be in a contiguous thing, and I already have some scratch space here, so.
Right. So question. Okay, so.
So it's sort of like too contiguous, and then you could have a just allocate the array if you have to, or be the span if you can, and then you could have a too contiguous with scratch space that could easily throw of, dude, the scratch space you gave me is smaller than count. You should have known that.
Do me a favor, Emo. Find the get span proposal in here.
Find the get span proposal. What do you mean?
There's a bug somewhere that has like a get span method on read-only sequence. That might be more. And it was filed by. Let me find it. Get. Was it? Nope.
Yeah, it's like unfortunately not a good name to look for.
I may have closed it, didn't I? Oh, it's closed. But it's in 5.0.
Fair enough. All right. Unfortunately, YouTube, I have to run, and I'm the host of the YouTube stream, so it'll drop when I leave. But
all right, that's fine.
And I'm not doing anything with the try read exact because I think we lost
leave
more
it as
along
is.
the way.
Yeah.
So good discussion.
Yep.
See everybody later.
Sounds good to me.
Bye.
Bye.